And it is drafted in the way that you just heard. We worked a lot on it. And that relationship, the word relationship that we find in that article, and the responsibilities towards future generations were carefully thought through, and we made sure that they were contained in that article, as we did for many other articles throughout the Declaration. So my suggestion yesterday, which I made yesterday, because I did a similar talk here last night, my suggestion is that any initiative of this sort that we have needs to take into consideration those standards and those norms that we find in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And there's also, of course, the Constitution of Canada that recognizes and affirms Aboriginal and treaty rights in this country. And over the years, as you probably know, the Supreme Court has came down with important decisions in that regard. I have in mind, for instance, when it comes to reconciliation, the Supreme Court talked about reconciliation even before the Commission, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was created in 2004, which was a forestry case in 2004, the Haida Nation case. And the Supreme Court says, when talking about reconciliation in that case, that the objective, and I'm quoting it by heart, the objective is to reconcile the pre-existing sovereignty of Indigenous peoples with the assumed sovereignty of the Crown. Those are the words of the Supreme Court, the assumed sovereignty of the Crown, which basically means they took over without a consent, without our permission. That's what the Supreme Court is saying. So that's our challenge, to reconcile that pre-existing sovereignty, which still exists to this day, and the assumed sovereignty of the Crown. That's our challenge. And any initiative that wishes to undertake or policy or law needs to be consistent with all of these cases. They also talked about in the same case that on important matters in regards to the environment and our lands, territories, and resources, on important matters that we need the full consent of Indigenous peoples, the full consent. We're not talking about free, prior, and informed consent, we're talking about full consent on important matters. And I suggest that pipelines is an important matter in this country. I also want to mention one of the more recent cases from the Supreme Court, the Chilcotin case. You probably don't know this, but not many times has the Supreme Court of Canada considered the rights of Indigenous peoples in this country as human rights. Although at the international level, in international forums, our rights have been considered as human rights for the last 3 decades. But never has the Supreme Court looked at our rights as human rights. And we need to start pushing for that. In the Chilcotin case, the Supreme Court says that the charter provisions of our Constitution that we find in Part 1 of the Constitution and Indigenous rights that we find in Section 35 and Part 2 of our Constitution are sister provisions. Sister provisions that serve to limit the powers of governments, both provincial and federal. That is the law today. We live in not a parliamentary supremacy anymore, but in a constitutional supremacy. It is the Constitution that should be our guide in our system. So that's why the Supreme Court said that these two parts in our Constitution serve to limit the powers of governments, both provincial and federal. So we always have to have that in mind whenever we're discussing these issues. I talked briefly yesterday also, as well about our own Indigenous laws. When we go out on the land, and I'm sure Saul does the same thing. There are laws that we need to respect. There are relations out on the land that we need to respect. That's why we use that word in Article 25. There are laws that we need to respect. And they still exist to this day. When I negotiated the 2002 agreement with the government of Quebec on forestry and other matters, I made sure that, you probably don't know, but there's not a definite word in Cree to express the concept of consent or the concept of veto. It doesn't exist. But we have a concept that is close to both consent and veto. A legal concept in Cree that is close to veto and consent. And when I negotiated that agreement, in particular with respect to forestry development in EUSG or Cree territory, I made sure that we included that process, how we go about it to achieve that. And to this day, I'm not sure if the government of Quebec realized that we incorporated Cree law into that agreement in 2002. I'm not sure. All I care about is the fact that it's in it. So those are the kind of things that we need, and that's what I mean by all of these different aspects in our toolbox are complementary. They are mutually reinforcing, and that's why I suggested that in all of these different initiatives of protected and conservation areas that are taken throughout the country and throughout the world, as a matter of fact, we need to incorporate those kind of things in those initiatives. And finally, I noticed that my 25 minutes is approaching. Finally, I just want to say that I'm glad to see that there's an Indigenous person in the provincial parliament at Queen's Park. I think it's a way for us to effect that change, as Judith was saying, to effect that change from our institutions, from within our institutions. I worked for the Cree and other Indigenous organizations for more than 35 years now. And I usually did it from outside the walls of the National Assembly of Quebec, from outside the walls of the Parliament of Canada. And I finally decided in 2011 to try it from within. And it took me almost seven and a half years to get my private member's bill on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples accepted by the Parliament of Canada. 7.5 years. I knew I had no chance with the Conservatives in my first mandate, but since the Liberal government promised that their new relationship with Indigenous peoples would be based on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, said, well, maybe I have a chance. Well, it took them 2.5 years to accept my bill, although that's exactly the promise that they made. But it's there now. And we're just waiting on the Senate to try to get it passed before the summer recess, because if we don't do it by then it's lost. My friend, late Jack Layton, had one of the most progressive private members bill on climate change. It got passed Parliament, but the Senate killed it. So I'm hoping that my bill will not encounter the same fate. The other thing, and this is what we mean by decolonizing our institutions. And I know Saul is trying to achieve the same thing at Queen's Park, and that is the use of our languages, as he mentioned, and rightfully should. So when I first got elected in 2011, one of the first things I did was to go and see the clerk of the House of Commons, who's the boss of the place, for the rules and procedures. And I asked, can I ask my questions in Cree? Can I do my speeches in Cree? And of course, at that time, in 2011, I was told no. The official languages of this place is French and English. And I said, how can that be? My language has been spoken on this land for the past 7,000 years. How can that be? So it took a while to get where we are today. As you probably know, the house will now be sitting in the west block, because center block is going to be in major renovation for the next 10 years. So there's a new place we will be seated, and speaking Cree will be allowed. There's an important committee that has concluded in its report that it is possible, that we should do it based on constitutional considerations, based on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that recognizes the right to understand and to be understood as Indigenous peoples in the economic, social, and political institutions of Canada. Those were my arguments to the committee, and they finally accept that.